Good evening. This is Pamela, and you're listening to Watchmen on the Pod. We are going to continue in our book reading, The Seventh Vial by J. Wylie. We are in chapter 15. I may have to turn the fan on, brothers and sisters, because I don't know what's going on with this old gal. That might be the problem, as I'm getting old, but I'm hot, I'm cold, I'm hot, I'm cold. I'm not sure, so forgive me. Chapter 15. The 10-horned and 7-headed beast of the sea. Before describing the third and last woe, we must speak of the object of that woe. We have had no occasion to do so till now, because he has not appeared on the apocalyptic scene. The next vision of John, however, brings him before us. Paul, as well as other apostles, had spoken of one whose coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders, the man of sin, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. But when Paul wrote, as he himself tells us, there were lets and hindrances in existence which obstructed the appearance of the man of sin and would continue to do so for some ages to come. But the apostle, intimidated, I wonder what that word is. Intimidated? At the same time that these obstructions should in due time cease to exist, that the let would be taken out of the way, and then that the wicked would be revealed, affording to the saints an opportunity of displaying their patience in the endurance of his tyranny, and to God of manifesting his power in breaking him in pieces. The Roman Empire, in its imperial form, was the grand let to the rise of popery in Paul's time and for some time after. It was necessary that the throne of the emperor should be abolished in order that the chair of the bishop might be erected in its room. And to what were the great acts of the drama we have been contemplating? The events falling under the seals and trumpets, directed, but just to break in pieces the fabric of imperial Rome, that the let being taken out of the way, the man of sin might be revealed. Accordingly, in the vision to which we have now come, we witness his portunus rise. And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And that is chapter 13. This chapter contains an account of the rise of 2 beasts. The first beast is represented as rising out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The second beast is represented as rising out of the earth, having 2 horns like a lamb, and speaking as a dragon. We shall briefly indicate what we are to understand by these 2 beasts. This will enable us to enter with advantage upon the exposition of the details of the symbols. The first beast, that which rose out of the sea, we take to be the secular empire with its papal head. The second beast, that which rose out of the earth, we take to be the hierarchy or ecclesiastical state. It was by the union of these two that the world was so long oppressed and the church brought to the very brink of extermination. Between the 2 branches of the papacy, there was as close and intimate alliance almost as between body and soul. The state served the same purpose to the popedom, which the horse does to the rider, which the hand does to the will. It was the beast on which the harlot rode. It was the arm by which the papacy executed all its cruel and bloody decrees. It appeared to John as if he was stationed on the seashore, and as he gazed upon the waters, which at the time were agitated with tempest, the Gothic invasion, he saw a monster emerging from the deep. His appearance was sufficiently dreadful. He had 7 heads, indicative of craft, 10 horns, the symbol of power, crowns upon his horns, the emblem of royalty, on his head, blasphemous titles, plainly indicating an idolatrous and impious character. Such was the frightful combination of evil qualities, craft, ferocity, power, impiety, which was apparent at the very first glance. Spencer was well hit off the salient features of this monster. Such one it was as that renowned snake, which great Alcides and Streamamona slew, long fostered in the filth of Lerna Lake, whose many heads outbutting ever knew, did breed him endless labor to subdue. But this same monster much more ugly was. For 7 gray heads out of his body grew, an iron breast and back of scaly brass, and all em- embrued in blood his eyes did shine as glass. His tail was stretched out in wondrous length, that to the house of heavenly gods it wrought, and with extorted power and bowered strength the ever burning lamps from thence it brought, and proudly threw to ground as things of naught, and underneath his filthy feet did tread the sacred things the holy host foretaught. Upon this dreadful beast with 7-fold head he set the false Deuces for more awe and dread. And that is from a book called Fairy Queen, Book One. It is usual in scripture to represent a tyrannical kingdom under the symbol of a wild beast. It is impossible not to admire the propriety of the symbol. It is the property of man to be ruled by reason, to be accessible to considerations of clemency and pity, and to have respect in his actions to the will of his Maker. It is the attribute of a beast, on the other hand, to be actuated only by brute passion and appetite. Now, have not the kingdoms of the world hitherto, and especially the 4 great despotisms seen by Daniel in vision, acted more like the beast of prey than as associations of reasonable and accountable beings? Have they not exercised a lawless violence all along, and done whatever they listed without regard to the will of him who ruleth among men? The certain import of the symbol then renders it clear that it is the rise of the tyrannical and persecuting power that is here prefigured. A reference to the prophecy of Daniel will give us material aid in determining the kingdom here symbolized. There is the closest resemblance as any one may see who compares the 2 descriptions between the 4th beast of Daniel and the beast of the sea seen by John. The description given by Daniel is such as to lead us to conclude that the 4th beast was a compound of the preceding 3, that it had the teeth of the Babylonian lion, the claws of the Persian bear, and the spotted skin of the Macedonian leopard. That is, it possessed all the prostitutes of its predecessors, in addition to its own characteristic qualities. Now, such is precisely the appearance of the beast of the sea. Verse 2. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. Hence, we conclude that it is one and the same political association which is symbolized by the 4th beast of Daniel and the beast of the sea of John. But the 4th beast of Daniel is, by the universal consent of expositors, the symbol of the Roman Empire. And it is this empire, therefore, that is symbolized by the beast of the sea. Only we have mainly to do with it in its divided form, as held forth by the 10 horns. We may note this farther point of resemblance, that the 2 beasts came to the same end. Daniel's is slain and his body is given to the devouring flame. John's is taken prisoner at the battle of Armageddon and is cast into the lake burning with fire and brimstone. A short commentary will make the application of the vision to the papal empire exceedingly plain. The beast rose out of the sea. The sea is the symbol of society in a state of agitation. The Western world at this time was convulsed. The winds that agitated it blew from the north and were formed by the Gothic nations, whose successive eruptions completely destroyed the fabric of the empire and plunged society into frightful confusion. It was out of this social flood that the 10 Roman kingdoms of modern Europe emerged, having 7 heads. Let us here avail ourselves of the aid of an interpreter who not mislead us. In Revelation chapter 17, verses 9 and 10, we are told the 7 heads have a twofold signification. First, they symbolize the 7 hills, which were to be the seat of the government of the kingdom. This, as Eliot remarks, is a character as important as it is obvious. It binds the power symbolized through all of its various mutations, from its earliest beginning to its end, to that same 7 hill locality, even like one adscriptum galiba, as and as an essential part of his very constitution and life. This leads us at once to the city of Rome. In the passage just referred to, we are farther informed that the 7 heads also symbolize 7 kings, i.e., 7 forms of government. Now, such is the number of distinct forms of government which the Roman Empire has assumed from first to last, and enumerated both by Livy and Tacitus: kings, consuls, dictators, decivers, military tribunes, emperors. Of these kings or forms of government, it was said, 5 are fallen, and one is, and the other is not yet come. 5 of these had fallen before the days of John. The sixth, namely the imperial, was then in being, and the seventh was then future. It was intimidated, and when he, the 7th head, cometh, he must continue a short space. Who is this 7th head, whose term of existence was to be so brief? On no point are apocalyptic commentators more divided or their conclusions more vague. Mead makes the 7th head the demi-Caesar, a Western emperor. Bishop Newton thinks the dukedom of Rome, established after the conquest of Hurley, is meant. Others suppose that the Christian emperors extending from Constantine to Augustulus constituted the 7th head and had its wound by the sword of the Hurley. Mr. Eliot finds the 7th head in the change of government that took place under Diocletian, who, together with his successors, in place of emperor or general of the Roman armies, became king or lord, and in place of the laurel crown and purple, assumed the diadem and robe of silk, the aesthetic symbols of absolute rule. This was followed by great and fundamental changes in the administration and is marked by Gibbon as the new form of administration. The empire henceforth was under the joint administration of 4 princes, 2 supreme rulers or Augustii, and 2 inferior ones as Caesars or Caesars. Caesars, I think that is. This was introduced not as a temporary expedient, but as a fundamental law of the Constitution. These are the nearest approaches which have been made to the solution of the difficulty of the 7th head. To our mind, none of these expositions are satisfactory, and therefore we here adopt a line of interpretation which we think takes us clear all these difficulties. There is no reason, as it appears to us, why we should confine our view to the last form of Satan's idolatrous empire, the Roman, to wit, and seek in connection with it all these 7 heads. Rather, let us take Satan's empire in its totality. The beast that rose out of the sea was no new monster. He had been seen on earth before. He had momentarily disappeared in a great catastrophe, but he rose again to resume his ravages. Idolatry was one continued confederacy from the beginning, being inspired all through by the same spirit, even the old serpent, the devil. Nevertheless, it culminated in seven great empires or heads which rose in succession. The first was Egypt, the earliest persecutor of the church. The second was Assyria. The third was Babylon. The fourth was the Medo Persian. Then fifth came the Grecian power, and sixth the Roman, which was in being at the time of the prophecy. Under the sixth head, the head then in being, was the beast destined to pass out of view for a short time, to suffer a brief extinction. It was to be slain by the sword of the Goths, and so to become the beast that was and is not. And I saw one of its heads as it were wounded to death, but it was to revive in the form of the 10 kingdoms of modern Europe. It was essentially the same pagan kingdom, Satan inspired, which had lived in its five previous heads: Egypt, Assyria, Babylonian, Medo Persia, and Greece, and which in John's time was existing in its Roman head, which was to arise from its apparent death by the Gothic invasion, emerge from the weltering flood of the 6th century, and to live a second time in the 10 kingdoms of Europe under its head, the Pope. A sort of dual character was to belong to this head, for it is counted as both the seventh and the eighth. And in actual fact, this duality of head or government has characterized modern Europe. In one aspect, its 10 kings were its head; in another, its head was the papacy. In the papacy, the 10 kingdoms found a common bond of union and a common center of action. Under their chief, the Pope, they were marshaled in one empire, which was inspired by one spirit and ruled by one law, which obeyed one will and pursued one grand aim, all having a common source in the chair of the popes. Both a temporal and spiritual supremacy did the Pope wield over Europe. This supremacy is necessarily inherent in the fundamental dogma of the papacy. The Pope is the vicar of Christ according to the Romish teaching, but to Christ has been given all power in heaven and in earth. He is a King of kings, and if the Pope be what Christ is, he must possess the power which Christ possesses. He must be a King of kings. And in fact, he did claim this power for many ages. And in disposing sovereigns, releasing subjects from their allegiance, disposing of crowns, and annulling laws, the Pope demeaned himself as the Lord Paramount of Europe, both in temporals and spirituals. This jurisdiction he exercised not as the modern popish gloss would have it, but by the general consent and acquiescence, I don't know, of the kings and nations of the period. He claimed it as of divine right and as one to whom the God of heaven had delegated his divine prerogatives, commissioning him to represent him on earth. In short, as one who had been enthroned as vice God, and into whose hands had been delivered all the kings and kingdoms of the earth. A singular and apparently contradictory account is given of the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. How was it possible that both statements could be true? That the beast had ceased to exist and yet was in existence, when it was the object of wonder to all who dwelt on the earth? What we have already said will enable us to understand this. The beast was in the five idolatrous empires or heads which had already fallen. The beast is not, for its sixth head, the Roman, had followed its predecessors and gone out of existence during the Gothic eruptions. The beast is, that is, when the whole world wondered after it and bowed down and worshiped before it because it had returned from the abyss and was living again in the last head, the papal. It was the same infernal idolatrous beast throughout, but in respect of the successive eras at which its heads flourished, it was the beast that was and is not, and yet is. He is the eighth and is of the seventh and goes into perdition. This discloses its end. The eighth beast will have no successor. The Dicam Regal form, such as is seen in modern papal Europe, will be the last organization which idolatry will be suffered to assume. When Rome imperial fell, Rome papal rose, but this will not occur over again. The beast will have no second resurrection. In its form of 10 kingdoms under its chief, the Pope, it will fill up its cup and go into its own place. It goeth into perdition, final perdition. For never will it be seen coming up again from the abyss, which will then open to receive it. And 10 horns. This is explained in chapter 17, verse 12. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, not individual kings, but lines of rulers or kingdoms, which have received no kingdom as yet, an intimidation that their appearance was still future. The kingdom had to be broken in pieces by the shock of the barbarous nations, and out of what had been one undivided monarchy, 10 distinct and independent kingdoms were to arise. It is well known that such was the origin of the 10 Roman kingdoms of Europe. Let us trace the boundary line of the Western Empire. The wall of Adrian, dividing Scotland from England, forms the boundary on the north. This line we prolong across the German Ocean to the Rhine. We ascend the river to Baden Baden, thence strike eastward to the source of the Danube, which we descend to Belgrade, and thence in a southwestern direction across the Adriatic and Mediterranean to the great desert of Africa. This line will include the Roman Empire of the West, and on this platform were the 10 kingdoms to arise. We should expect that these 10 kingdoms will be formed not long after the Gothic invasion, for the beast emerged from the flood. With all the 10 horns already apparent, we are disposed to take the era AD 532. At that epoch, we find the following 10 kingdoms within the limits we have traced: the Anglo Saxons, the Franks of Central, the Alman Franks of Eastern, the Burgundic Franks of southeastern France, the Visigoths, the Suevi, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Bavarians, and the Lombards. Great changes have occurred at various periods in Europe. Some of its states have fallen and others have arisen. But from the Gothic invasion to the present era 10 has been the prevailing number of its kingdoms. Of these 10 kings or kingdoms, it was said that they received power as kings 1 hour with the beast. The 1 hour indicates not the duration of their power, but the time when they should receive it. Their formation as independent kingdoms and the development of the beast would synchronize. Both should receive their power at one and the same time. It was at the end of the 5th century, or rather the beginning of the 6th, that the formation of the 10 Gothic kingdoms were completed. And by this time, the Pope, supported by the decrees of councils and the acquiescence of kings, had asserted his character of vicar of Christ and vicegerent of God, and had begun to exhibit the anti Christian characteristics of blasphemy against God and rage against his saints. No sooner had the beast of the sea appeared than the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. The dragon recognized the beast newly arisen as the lineal descendant of pagan Rome, and as such hastened to serve him heir to all the power, wealth, and dominion of that empire. By the seed of the dragon is denoted the countries over which Rome had swayed the scepter, which included the richest lands and the wealthiest cities of the Western world. Of all these, once the possession of pagan Rome, papal Rome has long been mistress. She occupies the same seat as the dragon of old. On his heads were names of blasphemy. All the great empires from Egypt downwards were idolatrous. Blasphemy was written on every one of them. Every form of government which has risen at Rome has assumed titles and aggregated powers of a blasphemous character. The chief magistrate of the Romans from the first was the high priest, Pontifex Maximus, and the supreme authority in matters ecclesiastical. To come down to the emperor, some of them were addressed as the August and the Eternal One. Most of them were worshipped as God after death, and some of them were so even before it. The last head, the papacy, has far surpassed its predecessors. There is nothing in the history of the universe that equals the blasphemous titles and powers which the have assumed. Popes have assumed. They have openly laid claim to be regarded as vicar of Christ, the vicegerent of the Creator, and governor of the world. And on that claim is built up the tremendous and monstrous fabric, partly civil and partly ecclesiastical, that constitutes the papacy. And all the world wondered after the beast. This was partly owing to what is stated before, namely, that his deadly wound was healed. The event was so marvelous that it drew the admiration of all that dwelt upon the earth to the beast that was the subject of it. When it was pierced by the sword of the Goths, men thought there was now an end of that terrible kingdom, which had shed so much blood and devoured so much flesh. But when they saw it revive in its 10 horns or kingdoms, occupying the same territory, governed by the same laws as its predecessor, and finding a new bond of union in the papacy, it appeared to them as if Rome had returned from her grave. So completely had the wound been healed. This appeared little less than a miracle in the eyes of a blinded world, which accordingly fell down before the beast. They had worshipped the dragon, given unbounded admiration and implicit obedience to every edict of pagan Rome, whether it regarded things civil or things spiritual. It had dictated supremely both law and religion. And when they saw the beast sitting on the same throne and wielding the same power as the dragon, they could render nothing less to the beast than they had given aforetime to the dragon. And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? The religion of papal Rome was but a revival of that of pagan Rome under different names, and it became an easy matter to those who dwelt upon the earth to transfer their worship from one to the other. They who had worshipped demons could do so by whatever name they were called, whether the classic one of Venus or the Christian one of Mary. And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. When the beast found himself on the throne of the dragon, and the world prostrate before him, his heart was lifted up within him, like that of the king of Babylon of old. He imagined himself to be some great one, to be God, and the pride of his heart found vent in the dreadfully blasphemous words of his mouth. He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. No names have been so fearfully blasphemous as those which the Pope has assumed. He has claimed dominion over the whole world, and as if this were not enough, he has extended it into the other. Whom he will, he can consign to hell, and whom he will, he can save from it. The gates of paradise he can lock and unlock. He has issued his order to angels, straightly charging them to do his bidding. We command the angels of paradise to introduce that soul into heaven, said Clement the Sixth, of such as might die on their pilgrimage to Rome in the year of Jubilee. He has exercised authority over devils, compelling them to release such as he wished to deliver from the flames. Gregory the Great rescued thus the soul of pagan Emperor Trojan. To speak of his setting his throne above that of kings is nothing remarkable. He has exalted it above that of angels and archangels. He has exalted it above God himself. He has annulled divine ordinances and claimed a power to abrogate the moral law, thus challenging an authority superior to that form which the law emanated. He has sat in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. To the Romanist Church, writes Clement II, every knee must bow of things on earth, and that at his pleasure even the door of heaven is open and shut. We find Cardinal Domini writing to Victor the second, introducing Christ as speaking, I have appointed thee to be as the father of emperors. I have delivered into thy hands the keys of the whole church universal, and placed thee my vicar over her. Yea, by the removal of the king, the Emperor Henry III had just died, have granted thee the rights of the whole Roman Empire, now vacant. We find Innocent the Third calling himself the lieutenant of him who hath written upon his vesture and on his thigh, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and telling King Richard that he held the place of God upon earth, and without distinction of persons he would punish the men and the nations that presumed to oppose his commands. We find Clement the Seventh affirming in a letter to King Charles the Sixth that as there is but one God in the heavens, so there cannot nor ought to be of right but one God on earth. Wow. Palatinus thus addresses Alexander the Sixth. We rejoice to see you raised above all human things and exalted even to divinity itself, seeing there is nothing except God which is not put under you. Under the pontifical arms at the coronation of the Pope we have just named was inscribed this distich: Caesar Magna, food, whatever. I can't say these words. I'm sorry, people. I can't pronounce this. This is Latin, I think. I want to say Greek, but I think it's Latin. All right. But not to multiply proofs, we close with the very extraordinary titles assumed by Martin V in the instructions given to a nuncio sent to Constantinople, the most holy and most blessed, who was invested with heavenly power, who was Lord on earth, the successor of Peter, the Christ or anointed of the Lord of the universe, the Father of kings, the light of the world, the sovereign pontiff, Pope Martin. Nor are we to suppose that this was a mere empty boast or unallowed claim like the high sounding titles which Eastern despots have sometimes assumed. It was ratified by councils, submitted to by kings, and exercised in the very spirit in which it was aggregated over the persons, consciences, and lives of all men. There is not a fact in history better established than the literal fulfillment of what is here foretold. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And thus, too, was Paul's prophecy in his epistle to the Thessalonians fulfilled: who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. We have already spoken of this war under the head of the witnesses, and our space does not permit us to reopen the subject. There is not one of the 10 horns which has not, at one period or another of its history, persecuted the saints, nor is there a spot in Europe within the limits we have formerly traced which has not been sprinkled with their blood. We need only name the murderous crusades carried on for ages against the Waldenses and Albigenes, the slaughter of the Piedmontese, whose bones whiten the Alps, the martyrs of Provence, whose blood tinged so oft the blue waters of Rhone, the massacre of St. Bartholomew in August 1572, which continued 3 days, and in which in Paris alone 30,000 Protestants, and throughout the departments of France 40,000 more perished. The news of this terrible slaughter was received at Rome with the ringing of bells and the firing of cannons, while the medal of Gregory commemorates it to this day as a deed of illustrious virtue. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 under Louis XIV, when, as has been commuted, many thousand Protestant churches were razed, a million of citizens were driven into banishment, 100,000 were murdered, while those whom the sword spared were consigned to the galleys, and many of the youth of both sexes were transported as slaves to the West Indies. The bloody wars of Alva in the Low Countries, who boasted that in the course of a few years 36,000 had died by the common executioner. The suppression of the Reformation in Spain and Italy by the terrors of the axe, the faggot, and the horrors of the Inquisition. Besides the countless thousands who perished at other times and in other parts of Europe, of whom no record has been kept, and whose names shall never be known till the books are open. Engraven on the page of history stands the record of her crimes. Rome shall perish, but this record is eternal. To the end of time, not a line of its crimson writing shall be effaced, and so long as it continues to be read, it will excite the mingled horror and indignation of mankind. But the most marvelous thing in the prophecy is that the beast should overcome in the war, i.e., in the first instance. For in the final issue, the Lamb shall overcome. Let us here mark the adorable sovereignty of God. This power to make war and to overcome in the war was given unto the beast. Thou couldst have no power at all against me, said Christ, when standing before Pilate to be judged, had it not been given thee from above. The beast, in the plenitude of his pride and power, thought that he might do according to his will, without having respect to any god or man, saying no doubt with the king of old, who is he that can deliver out of my hand? The beast was mistaken herein. He could not have split a drop of the church's blood, nor have touched a hair on her head, had he not received power from above. And why did God permit his fold so long to be a field of slaughter? Why did the church's blood continue to flow and her groans to ascend to heaven, while he stood by as one who either would not or could not deliver? We know not. But this we know, that it was God who did it, and that he had wise purposes for doing it, and that he will yet bring good out of it all, and glorify both himself and the church by the course of suffering through which he has led her. Praise God. And that ends chapter. What chapter is that? 15. 15. Next time we'll pick up in 16. All right, brothers and sisters, I love you dearly with all of my heart. I'm going to end that now, pick up later, and just keep your eyes on Jesus. Always. Never take your eyes off him, not for a split second. And your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And embed the Word of God upon the tablets of your hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. I love you so very much. Bye bye.